say welcome, Jemar, for being here. We are just reflecting on just this past, everyone's waving, this past week, just as we came up on the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd in our community. And we're just kind of having a chat about that for now. But we just want to welcome you. It's a privilege and honor to have you. You have been such a light to so many of us in Minnesota, especially in the past year. Of course, I'm going to do a little bit of introduction, but most people know who you are. Jemar Tisby is the award-winning author of The Color of Compromise, and of course, the book that we read this past session for our Be the Bridge group, How to Fight Racism. And he's the president and founder of The Witness, and he's currently out in Boston, and he's one of the directors of the Anti-Racism Research Center there. And so we just want to welcome you. Again, I wanted to share a little bit real quick because I don't think a lot of people know this, but one of the reasons why our particular chapter, Be the Bridge, is because of you, Jemar. 2019, you came to Minnesota, and one of my friends, Melissa, who's an activist in Brooklyn Center, she got me to come hear you speak. And Transform Ministry brought you here to Minnesota, and Carl Nelson, I think, is here as well. He's the president of Transform. But anyway, the words you spoke really just touched my heart and really convicted me. I'd kind of been feeling in my heart for at least 3 years that we needed to have these conversations about racial justice. And I just kind of ignored it, kept my head down and just kind of said, you know, not me, someone else. And so, but anyway, I went to your talk and your words just really spoke to us. And so we have you to blame for us being here. And just thank you for that, for starting us on this journey in many ways. So let's begin our conversation. And I have kind of 2 questions I want to start us off with. In your book, you talked about Michael Brown's killing and how that was a catalyst for you to kind of think about going beyond thinking about justice at the racial reconciliation level, but to move beyond that to thinking about systematic issues with policies and institutions, and just how looking at that through a different lens, looking at justice through a different lens, kind of spurred you to think more and broader. And for many, George Floyd is that particular incident for them. Here in this room, this virtual room, George Floyd was that for many people. Their eyes were opened, they were woke, and they were asking the questions of, what do we do next? And where do we even begin? And I think you also mentioned in your book that one of the reasons why you wrote this book is because you often came across many people saying, where do we begin? Where do we begin in this conversation? What do we do about the injustices we see? And I just want to ask you kind of 2 questions around that. So we kind of know a little bit about the why, but I want to know the process before, many years before you even wrote this book. I want you to kind of tell us and give us a window into your life of sort of the pivotal moments that got you on this track of racial justice and the journey that got you to where you are now. And then, so talking about your past, but then also bridging that with your future vision of what you would like to do at the work in the place that you are right now at the Anti-Racism Center. So talking about your past and then your future. Thank you, Jemar.
What up, good people? Carl, I see you, Doc. You brought me up there. So I had to shout out to Transform and shout out to this group. I know you were just talking about some really heavy stuff here. So pardon me for not reading the room. I'm just excited to see you all. So, hey.
I'm excited you're here.
Hey, man, you didn't tell me everybody was so good looking too. Everybody looking good. Jemar Tisby, thrilled to join you. You didn't know this, but I've been praying for y'all. Up in Minnesota, Minneapolis area, all eyes on you, to paraphrase Tupac. Some of y'all will get that. And Amina, you know one of my new coworkers. Is that correct?
I do, Monica. We were students together in a
That's wild.
program. Yeah.
I'm gonna text her right after that. So she's one of the 2 or 3 people I work with most closely at the Center for Anti-Racist Research.
Yes, she's awesome.
So I just started that job. I'm working virtually now. We'll relocate to Boston late this summer. If anybody has leads on affordable housing, because Boston, look, it is like a slap in the face every time I get on to look for a place, especially if you know anything about the cost of living in the Delta. It is rude. It is absolutely rude. So I'm glad to be here. I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't know what tangent I might get off on, because I have many soapboxes arranged here, and I'm not quite sure which one I will step onto. But you asked a little bit about the history. So you jumped off talking about racial reconciliation, racial justice. Here's my latest theory. This is hot off the presses. This is fresh hotness right out the studio. If you are a millennial, which I'm sort of on the cusp, I'm an elder millennial. I've heard the phrase geriatric millennial, which is another slap in the face.
Yes, that's me.
All right. So our generation was basically the first generation born into the post-desegregated church. Now, there were others who were alive during, we were born into the transition. Now, notice I said desegregated, not integrated. Desegregated, not integrated. We hear that? There's a difference. Desegregated means the barriers are down. Integrated means you're actually included and welcomed. I don't think that's happened on a broad scale for many of us. Now, being born in the post-desegregated church era meant that people like me had access into predominantly white Christian spaces, which is where much of my time as a Christian has been. I didn't really grow up in a church background. Some of y'all grew up in the Black church or the Lutheran church or whatever it might be. I just didn't grow up with much of a church background at all. Then when I became a Christian in high school, it was through a white evangelical church, right? So we had that kind of access that generations prior just didn't have, at least not on a broad scale. But what they didn't tell us was how to maneuver in those spaces. Particularly as Black people. How can you be fully Black and fully Christian in these predominantly white spaces? That is the challenge to this day. I'll also say that I'm thinking, putting on my historian's hat, I think there is a distinct era of the evangelical racial reconciliation movement. I would say it's probably early 90s to early 2010s, when racial reconciliation started to become the thing, particularly for white evangelicals, right? Problem was, and to this day, is the understanding of racism is highly individualistic. It's defined mainly in terms of interpersonal attitudes. And you've heard this before, because it's evidenced in phrases like, some of my best friends are Black. I treat all people the same. I don't see color. What they're talking about is their personal attitudes toward people who are different, right? Now, if that is the sort of sum total of what race is about, your personal attitudes, then guess what? The solution to the problem of racism is just nice to people. That's where you hear the phrase, I don't have a racist bone in my body. Which anatomically speaking, what bone is that? Is that the femur, the ulna, the hammer in the ear? What is it? Apparently nobody can locate the racist bone. Nobody has it. That's because they're thinking individually and interpersonally about racism, from which stems the idea of the racial reconciliation movement in evangelicalism. If the problem is interpersonal and individual, if the problem is broken relationships, then the solution is that song, the more we get together, the happier we'll be. As I call it, it's getting different hues in the pews. Now I get 10 cents every time you say that. Different hues in the pews. And that was seen as the solution. And I bought into it. I'll confess, this is part of my story, my journey, my witness, my testimony. I bought wholesale into it. This is the whole multiracial church movement. I can't remember the exact statistics, but the number is growing for mega churches. Many mega churches. Churches, I believe over 1,000 people are considered mega churches. Many are multi-ethnic by the measure of no single racial or ethnic group is more than 80% of the congregation. So they have at least 20% different races and ethnicities, right? It's a big number in mega churches, and it's growing. It's been growing the past 20 or 30 years, but still, a minority. Anyway, what I discovered in the 2010s, some call us, I mentioned the geriatric millennials, some call us the Trayvon Martin generation.
Yeah.
I remember Trayvon Martin, 2012, shot and killed by a vigilante, Sanford, Florida. And then 2013, you remember what happened? This killer was acquitted. And on Facebook, 3 Black activists, women, say, Black people, I love you. Our lives matter, which transformed into Black Lives Matter. Nobody knew about that till August 2014. Mike Brown is killed. Black Lives Matter becomes the banner for the next wave of the Black freedom struggle. I'm gonna geek out for a second. Historians refer to the sort of collective historical efforts for Black people to secure their rights and liberation as the Black freedom struggle. The Black freedom struggle has been going on since the 1600s, at least, when people of African descent were brought to the coast of colonial Virginia. There's always been some form of resistance, but there are different waves, from the abolition movement to the anti-lynching movement to the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement. And the latest iteration is the Black Lives Matter movement as part of the longer Black freedom struggle. And Black Lives Matter becomes that banner, right? And it's in the midst of that I discovered, it's really not transformative to get people who look different into the same room. It's really not transformative to spend an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours on Sunday morning with people who look different from you and expect that life Monday through Saturday is going to change significantly.
Mm-hmm.
Are you picking what I'm putting down?
Yeah.
We put all this emphasis on 2 things, diversity and Sunday morning, as Christians, without paying much attention to what's happening Monday through Saturday in the day-to-day lives, practices, policies, and laws that shape our interactions, right? So it was around that time, 2014, 15, 16, and I can go through the litany of what's happening, right? We've got these cell phone videos of Black people being brutalized. We've got a presidential election, which took place November 2016, but understand the primaries were taking place from summer 2015 all the way to November 2016. So it's a much longer election cycle than just that month, right?
Right.
We've got the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. We've got the Emmanuel Night. All this stuff is happening, you remember? And it was in the midst of that I'm like, you know what? This stuff of different hues in the pews is not actually transforming the inequities and the injustices in our society. So that's when I said, this has got to be about more than quote unquote reconciliation. It's got to be more than just relationships. It's got to be about justice. Dikaio Sune, you biblical scholars out there. It's got to be, so here's my first sort of practical piece of advice. If your church wants to see racial and ethnic diversity, don't make diversity the goal, make justice the goal. Don't make diversity the goal, make justice the goal.
Yeah.
That's what we really want. I would feel more comfortable personally in a predominantly white church that was serious about justice than a church that was multiracial but had diversity as its main thing. You know what I mean?
Right.
I'm gonna pause there. I don't know if I answered any of your questions, but that was one of my soapboxes. I'm gonna kick that away, and then I'm gonna pull up the next one.
All right, I'm going to pass it off to Lord Me. He's
Yes. Hello, Mr. Tisby. Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to sit with you because I have both your books. My son read The Color of Compromise, who was 14. I'm raising 4 sons, and so this question is in regards to police reform.
My.
Yes. You talk about in your book in Ferguson, it seemed that those who live in Ferguson, predominantly Black American neighborhoods, were seen by the city and police department to be less as constituents to be protected than as potential offenders and a source of revenue. You also talk about how the one bad apple theory does not really explain the decade of police brutality. Can you talk some more about what you see to be the primary problems, and then also discuss how you see the church rising up to be able to solve those problems? And I think you hinted on the fact of the justice being the primary thing. But just speaking from a personal experience, like I said, I'm raising 4 boys here in Minnesota, and it's challenging to attend a predominantly white church, to be seen, to raise Black sons in a suburban neighborhood, and feeling the real concern as a Black mother in that space. So can you touch on that for us?
Is it Lord Me? How do I say it?
Yes,
right?
You said it correctly, Lord Me, like Lord Me.
That's beautiful. You just brought one of my biggest soapboxes up on police. So I think there are 2 major justice areas that we should be concerned with as people in the United States and as Christians in particular. I think there are 2. One is voting rights. And the amount of voter suppression that is happening all over the country is absolutely chilling. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, if we don't protect the constitutional right to vote, we're looking at an authoritarian regime, literally. And guess what? It's next year is do or die. 2022 federal midterm elections. 2024 is going to be too late in terms of the presidential election. We need to think deeply and seriously about the filibuster too. I don't have a definitive explanation or stance on it, but right now it's the filibuster that's holding up HR 1, which is the major voting rights legislation at the federal level. The second justice issue that I would bring up is anti-Black police brutality. Anti-Black police brutality. Understand that for every movement in the Black freedom struggle, there's been a single particular justice issue that has catalyzed and coalesced resistance, right? So in the 19th century, it was race-based chattel slavery in the abolitionist movement. In the Jim Crow era, it was lynching. In the civil rights era, it was voting rights and segregation. And now it is anti-Black police brutality. Most of the biggest uprisings that we've seen happen around that, whether Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. This book, I'm so excited, I get to tell you, this is brand new, hot off the presses. This is advanced copies, The Coming Race Wars by William Bill Pennell. This is an updated and expanded edition. I get to write a new introduction. I'm super thrilled about it. Bill Pennell is a Black evangelical. He's in his 90s right now. And he wrote this book, The Coming Race Wars, in the wake of Rodney King. Y'all remember that? It was one of the first instances we had of a recorded incident of anti-Black police brutality. It was horrific. And guess what? An all-white jury acquitted all 4 police officers who were charged, and it was in the wake of the acquittal that the LA uprisings happened, right? Same thing with Mike Brown. Isn't it interesting that Black people have so much patience that we will let the system work itself out? Even in the face of horrific anti-Black brutality, we will let it go to the courts. But it's when no one is held accountable that the outrage erupts. Anyway, that's a bonus because I like y'all. To the question. The talk. Probably most of you in this group have heard of the talk. The talk is the conversation that all Black parents have with their Black children, especially their Black sons, about how to survive an encounter with the police. Now that's the talk that Black folks and people of color have to have. The talk that white folk have to have with your children is that Black and white folk don't get treated the same by the cops. I've never had a positive interaction with the police. I've had horrific and less bad interactions. That's it. And I'm sorry, this is not about individuals. This is about culture. I was at, I spent a week in Boston last week. On my way back, I accidentally put my license into my checked luggage. So I didn't have ID to go through TSA. Thankfully, they allow you to show other forms of ID as long as you've got your boarding pass, right? So that's what I did. But in order to do that, they called literally four TSA agents all at the same time. And the lead, the manager, whatever, was this tall, burly white dude who crossed his arms and interrogated me right there in front of everybody. What happened to your ID? I think I lost it. You think you lost it? Where is it? Did you have it when you came? I mean, swinging his authority around like he was something. This is TSA. They ain't got no guns. They haven't, you know? Point being, there's a culture around these kinds of institutions so that you can take even the most well-meaning person. By the way, they don't even have to be white, but you embed them in a culture where your currency is authority and fear and the ability to wield force. And it changes your behavior. It's almost like peer pressure. That's what our law enforcement is like. So my most harrowing personal experience with law enforcement, I'm on a rural Mississippi road, headed down to Cleveland, Mississippi, and a cop starts tailing me on the highway. It's a 2-lane highway. Mind you, I had been pulled over at least once a month for the past 4 months. I was in a Pontiac Grand Am, little green, this is probably a 2003 car. Cost me $4,000. It's a grandma car. It's not like, I don't know what it was about this vehicle, but I had gotten pulled over a lot. So the cop starts tailing me, finally turns on his lights. I had turned actually to see if he was actually tailing me. And it was even down a more deserted highway, right? And so as soon as I do that, he turns on his lights. He pulls me over. And I do something wrong, apparently. I had sunglasses on. And because it was, what, the 4th time in 4 months, I threw my sunglasses down. He saw that and was immediately on his guard. And when he come to the door, he doesn't just ask for license and registration, tell me get out of the car, put my hands on the hood, spread my legs, asked me a question I never heard before. He said, do you have anything sharp in your pockets that might poke me? Talking about like a drug syringe or needle, right? Pats me down, tells me to keep my hands on the car, then searches my car. I didn't know you could not consent to all this stuff. Because once you leave town in Mississippi, everything's an hour or more away. So I have these like Black and Mild cigars that I just have to keep me awake on long drives. Another thing I didn't know, apparently people take these Black and Milds, cut them open, dump out the tobacco and fill them with pot. So he sees these, he automatically assumes I'm using drugs, interrogates me, all this stuff. The whole thing takes like 20 minutes, just me and the cop out on this rural Mississippi road. At the end of it, he lets me go without even a ticket. Just looked suspicious. Probably a decent dude off the job. But when you understand the roots of policing, enslaved patrols literally meant to control Black bodies. You will hear this phrase by activists, Black bodies. It's because our very physicality has been weaponized against us. May 25th, of course, was the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. It was also the anniversary of Christian Cooper, who was bird watching in Central Park. You remember this? And this Karen, her name was Amy Cooper, no relation, called the cops and acted as if she was in imminent physical danger. Why? Because of this man's Black body. When we look back at the history, I was just researching, sorry, I know this is a long answer, but this is a critical justice issue. I was just looking, I think it's tomorrow is the anniversary of the East St. Louis race riot. Now, when you hear that term race riot in the early 20th century, it means white people rioting. And it was a race riot that occurred in 2 waves. And the first one, I believe, began on May 28th. And again, related to police brutality in an encounter with a Black person. There was another incident I just learned about that happened in Detroit in the early 1960s. A Black man and his pregnant wife were in a public park with a phonograph, radio, and they were playing music. Other people gathered around, they were having a good time, got late, got dark. The couple left to take one of their friends back home, then they came back to the park. When they got back, the whole sort of tone and tenor had changed. Some white boys, some young white men had gathered around. The music was over, but there was still some milling about. One thing led to another. These white boys start taunting the Black guy and chase him. He tries to get in like the field house at the park. The custodian there, for whatever reason, doesn't let him in, even though they're banging on the doors. It's an emergency situation, right? Long story short, one of the white guys shoots and kills the Black man. Now, his wife was pregnant at the time, and a couple weeks later, she has a miscarriage, likely from the trauma of it all. The white boy, who was 23, was charged, never convicted. I say all that to say because the criminal justice system is working exactly how it was set up to work, which was to make white people feel safe and to control Black bodies. I'm sorry if that offends some of you. You maybe have relatives or friends who are in law enforcement. This is not really about individuals or individual attitudes. It's about an entire system which creates a culture and is based on a practice of controlling Black bodies. So there's that.
Thanks, Jemar. I hear you. I mean, I know a number of us from the BIPOC community here have so many stories when they've been pulled over. I myself, after Philando, my husband I feared for him. He drove in rural areas in Minnesota as well. And I remember telling him, he's a Black man and he works in a hospital. And I told him, put his badge and tape it to the window, because that's kind of how tense it was for us at that moment. And I think we embody that trauma, secondhand trauma, and it does affect how we feel, whether we feel safe around police officers because of these stories. And I think that's something that I really feel in my heart that we as Christians and the church need to be able to address this part of the puzzle. And going on with that, going back to kind of thinking about what the church, we as the church, capital C, what we should be doing in these things. I think, talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity and unity. So I'm going to bring up the unity thing. I think so many of us feel that we feel like we're troublemakers when we feel like our churches or our Christian community, family members, whatever, are not seeing these issues the way we see it, kind of like that light switch thing that you brought up before in your book and the smoke alarm. And I feel like as Christians, we put unity on this pedestal, and yes, we need to be unified. But when we have humanity being traumatized like this, it feels like people just want to hide that just in the sake of fake unity, fake peace. And I guess my question really is, even just going back to, I sent this quote to you about Dante Stewart saying, there's a vast difference between diversity and inclusion and liberation and justice. One enjoys the feeling of my presence and the other embraces the fullness of my humanity. And so for many of us in the BIPOC community, we want to be embraced at that level, that people can see how we feel when we see a Black man murdered, that could have been one of us. That could have been our husband, our brother, our son. That could be one of us. And we want the church to rise up on that occasion and not sort of say, we're not going to be divisive, or, this social justice, racial justice thing is not part of the gospel. So my question is, how do you respond, or how do you think the church should respond, kind of thinking about true unity that embraces the humanity of the Black, Indigenous, brown bodies in our communities, in our churches?
It's hard to do in the church, y'all. It's hard to do. Like if somebody were to ask you, what church do you think is doing, let's say, racial integration well? Maybe it's a multiracial. Who would you name? I mean, maybe you can come up with something. I would love to know. And I'm sure there are some, but it's really, really hard. And the very fact that we have historically Black denominations is a testimony to how hard it is. I was just reading about First Baptist Church in Montgomery. There's 2 First Baptist churches in Montgomery. Like there are a lot of 2 First Baptist churches in many cities. Why are there 2? There's the white one and there's the Black one. So when I talk about the First Baptist Church of Montgomery, you guys say, is it the white one or the Black one? First Baptist Church Montgomery, the Black one, started in 1867. Right after the Civil War, there was this mass exodus. One might say a Leave Loud campaign of Black people out of white churches and white denominations, because now they finally had emancipation and the freedom to form their own churches. Why would we form our own churches? So we wouldn't be treated as second-class citizens in the household of God. Understand though, here's the thing that burdens me. It's not the foaming at the mouth racists that are the biggest issue. It's not the folks who are planting the dynamite or weaving the noose for the lynch mob. It's all the people who stand by and let it happen. So what was happening in these churches, even in the 1860s, 1840s, whenever you want to say, Black people were in the churches, they were being preached to, but they were in the balcony. Their own ministers either couldn't be ordained as ministers in these white denominations, or if they were, could only preach to Black people, because you couldn't preach to white people. That would be a sign of authority. 1667, Virginia Assembly passes a law that says baptism would not emancipate an enslaved Native American, person of African descent, or mixed race descent. So it's this sort of subtle death by 1,000 cuts, signing and signifying that you're less than, or you're marginal. When I walk into a church, a few things assail me, whether I want them to or not. One is the visual. Is it a sea of white? Am I the one chocolate chip in the vanilla ice cream? Whatever analogy you want to use, that's the first thing. The dress, of physical attire of people, that's the next thing. Can I wear, I don't yet have camo pants. I've been thinking about getting them, but I'm a pretty sort of mild stylistic person, but I kind of want to try some camo pants. Would I be able to wear a fitted hat? I don't do hats, but I know other people, right? So the attire. The language of the prayers. I come from a Presbyterian background as an adult, and it's very formal, which is fine. It's just a particular culture, right? And then the music. Do I know the songs? And even the songs I know, stylistically, are they something I'm familiar with as a Black person or person of color? And the preaching, and I don't just mean the aesthetics of the preaching, although there does tend to be in Eurocentric white churches, the assumption that emotion and passion is somehow less intellectual or less theological, right? That's not the same in, I won't even just say Black church tradition. That's not the same in Pentecostalism. That's not the same in Latin America. That's not the same in Korea. It's a very white, European, Western kind of way to do it. But beyond the sort of delivery of the sermon, the illustrations and the applications of the sermon. I'm dating myself as an elder millennial here, but it's the difference between using the TV sitcom Friends as an example and using Living Single as an example. Not everybody's going to get that, and that's the point. So those are the things I notice as you walk into churches. Are they sort of welcoming? But then again, I can deal with all of that stuff being sort of foreign or new if the church is really committed to justice. I'll pause.
Okay, Mr. Tisby, my question for you here is probably more of a current event as far as the 1619 project CRT. I want to kind of state some stats that I did some research on.
Okay.
CBS News analyzed that there is no national standard in 50 states for social studies that teaches the history of slavery, racism, or the civil rights movement. In this, they found 7 states that does not mention slavery, 8 states that does not mention the civil rights movement, 2 states that only mentions white supremacy, 16 states that mention states' right as the cause of the Civil War. And, recently critical race theory has been made in the public discourse in Christian circles as something big. And you see right-wing media and Republican politicians trying to ban critical race theory or even the education of slavery. And I know it's frustrating for most of us who knows that that's a conflated issue when they're conflating those two things with social justice and education of slavery and racism. and just full history of our country. My question for you is, how does critical race theory compare with what the Bible says when addressing racial issues? And if you can touch on even the recent story about Hannah Jones, who did not get her tenure because of the 1619 Project. And this is something that I feel like is relatively not, people are speaking on and not being well informed, because they throw critical race theory like it's, you know, mayonnaise on a sandwich, and they're not even knowing what it is exactly. So can you touch on that for us?
You keep pulling up all my soapboxes.
It's mine too, that's why.
So here's my latest thought. It's our kids who are going to be the biggest casualties of the war on critical race theory. Our kids are going to be the biggest casualties of the war on critical race theory. Jemar, what are you talking about? Because what they're talking about banning in our schools is an honest education about racism and white supremacy in this country. With the book, The Color of Compromise, one of the most frequent responses I get from people, Black and white, is, I never knew. I never knew this history. I never knew this happened. I never knew this person. I never knew this event. Can you imagine what our kids are going to say 5, 10, 15 years from now if these bills get passed into law? What they will never learn, K through 12 or even in college. Our kids are going to be the biggest casualties of this ideological war on critical race theory, the 1619 Project. And then understand what's happening here. It's a couple levels. Number one, they don't know about critical race theory. I don't know about critical race theory. How many of y'all know about critical race theory? Nobody's actually teaching this. Who assigned Derek Bell in your classes? Who assigned Kimberly Crenshaw in your classes? These are some like primary source materials on critical race theory. That is not happening. Certainly not K through 12, right? So the very accusation is specious. And then they'll lump the 1619 Project in, which is a little bit more on the nose, because what they hate is the idea. So what 1619 Project said is, instead of 1776 as sort of the birth of the nation and the starting point for our country, what if we look back at 1619, when 20 and odd Negroes were brought to the coast of colonial Virginia in what evolved into race-based chattel slavery? What if that's the actual starting point for our nation? What if race and white supremacy are actually embedded from before the beginning of the political entity called the United States? So what folks are hating about that, and it's just, I'm just being honest, it's mostly conservatives. It just is. What they hate about that is this idea of undermining what I would call the myth of American exceptionalism, this great experiment in democracy, this political system that's superior to all other nations. And they hate the idea that if you're white, you could be implicated in white supremacy without ever intentionally meaning to. They hate the idea that you can benefit from white supremacy passively just by not opposing the system, right? That's what they're objecting to. And then they use these label of critical race theory and the 1619 Project as sort of scare tactics or fear mongering. It gives you an anchor to focus all your hate like a lightning rod, right? That's what's happening, right? The other thing that's happening is that fundamentally this is a distraction from what is the real threat, which is nationalism. And in religious circles, it's Christian nationalism. So what did we see on January 6th? The insurrection. You saw all of these Christian symbols, from a cross to Bibles, to the so-called QAnon shaman praying in Congress in the name of Jesus, as they're breaking the law, as thousands of people are threatening the lives of elected officials. Yeah. That's the real threat, y'all. Mm-hmm. And threat is actually kind of a misnomer, because that implies the possibility that it might not happen. That implies a certain distance. The reality is the enemy is within the camp. Christian nationalism is already in the church, and it's so ubiquitous that most people don't even recognize it as Christian nationalism. There's like, that's just Christianity. Of course, we have American flags in the pulpit. Of course, the 4th of July is a liturgical holiday for people. Of course, the Constitution is basically an inspired document. Of course, the nation was founded on Christian principles. It's so normal, common, ubiquitous that people don't even see it as a problem. What was your question?
Okay. So because you said all of that, and you answered some of my questions, I wanted you to also include the terms of woke that is being like used to kind of, you know, as a cudgel to this social justice movement. The question is, how can we use this movement that we're having, that we're in, social justice, or, you know, fighting for the right to have education being taught to our kids? How can we, being in this movement, amplify that? And what can the church do? And what does the Bible have to say about our fight in this racial justice movement?
I was seeing if I had the book on hand, Taking America Back for God by Perry and Whitehead. Taking America Back for God is all about Christian nationalism. They're two sociologists. That's a book you need to read. Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Cobes Dumais. So
read that book. That's a good book.
So bring the focus back to the real issue, which is Christian nationalism, right? Because we can get off on a tangent. Who was it? Toni Morrison, who said the function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from the work you're meant to do. So don't let them distract you. Now, it's become such a big issue that we actually have to know a little bit about it. Anytime you hear somebody using woke, it's going to be pejorative. Actual activists, nobody I know uses the term woke anymore, because it's been co-opted and gentrified by people. So that's an automatic kind of signal about where they're coming from. The other thing is, we have to disciple people off of Fox News. I mean, the mass media machine of disinformation is absolutely undermining both democracy and the church. And the way you do it, I think, I mean, there are actual like academics who study this stuff, like how to communicate to people who are resistant to ideas, how to communicate to people who have bought into conspiracy theories, all that stuff. Look up some of that stuff and let me know what you find. But the way I approached it with my white evangelical church is I preached a sermon on truth, how Christians should be committed to truth, because it's not primarily about bias. Every news outlet is going to have some bias. But even if you're biased, you can deal with like real facts, which ain't happening for Fox News, which is the most popular television news outlet in the country right now. And if that's the case, I mean, what the latest statistics I saw, 53% of Republicans think that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president and that Donald Trump is the real president. 53%. There's no reasoning with that until you get the facts straight. There's no reasoning with that until you're leaving in the same, what I call epistemological ecosystem. 10 cents every time you use that one. They're living in an alternate reality from what Kellyanne Conway said a few years ago, alternative facts. And it's getting more widespread. So y'all, what do we do about it? This is the front. This is the struggle in the church. It's over basic truth. We don't have to agree about the interpretation of truth, but we got to agree on the basic facts. Right? I'm not saying everybody needs to be Democrat or independent or Green Party or whatever, but please, can we agree that the election was not a fraud? If we can't get past that, I'm not sure we can stay in the same congregation. Like legit. How do you stay in fellowship with people who refuse to believe basic facts, data, and truth? I'm not talking about the interpretation. We can argue over the interpretation. We can disagree and be in fellowship over the interpretation, but what we can't do is have two sets of facts. I just think that's the thing. That's what's going to cause me to say, Mark chapter 6, dust off the sandals from your, dust off the dirt from your sandals and move on. I know this hurts for some of y'all white folks. This is in your family. These are deep, close friends. I hope you can persuade them. I would pursue it like I'm pursuing evangelism, where you're sharing the good news with people. You are praying for hearts to be changed, because that's how deep this is. This isn't primarily intellectual. Do my Denzel, huh? It's spiritual. So you got to pray that sucker out. And you also know that you won't convince everyone, or everyone won't be ready. What you might be doing is planting a seed that others water, right? But I will say this, whether you convince them or not, they ought to know where you stand. Just like your coworkers or friends or whatever, if you're doing it right, everybody you know knows you're a Christian. And in a derivative way, everybody you know ought to know that they're not going to accept some of this foolishness about the election being a fraud or critical race theory being the biggest threat. I may disagree with them, but I know where they stand. That ought to be our minimum goal, basic bar. I told you, you're going through all my soapboxes.
So Jemar, I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have time for a few more questions, or do you want to wrap it up? How are you on time?
Do y'all have time? Jemar been talking a lot. It's late for y'all.
We have time.
Yeah, I got time for a couple more. I'll try to be short. Promises.
Okay, so I guess this next question kind of relates to the relationships that you kind of pointed out a little bit. You quote Fannie Lou Hamer saying, "It's a funny thing, since I started working for Christ, it's kind of like the 23rd of Psalms when he says, 'Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointed my head with oil and my cup runneth over.'" And it's you point out that the more you pursue God's heart for justice, the more difficult life becomes. And a lot of us in this past year will say to you that one of the hardest things, and maybe most traumatic things, is having to have conversations about justice with people we love, and coming across fundamental differences and realizing that we're not on the same page. And along with that, we have just have a trauma of relationships lost and broken. And I think as Christians, we want to be reconcilers. We want to be at peace with our brothers and sisters. But this is not giving us peace. And I'm just wondering, how do you navigate that? And I know someone also, one of our members in our group asked, specifically about family members, about white family members who are kind of in denial about some of these issues, in denial about racism, whether it might be politics, Trump winning or not, all of those things, it's coming to light in this time. And just wondering, how do you navigate that, even as a Christian, and at your heart, maybe just wanting to be in fellowship with your own family? Like, how do you do that?
Wasn't it somewhere in the Bible Jesus said, do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a what? A sword. What did we think when Jesus said that, truth is going to divide? It's going to cut deep. That's what we're dealing with now, in my view, from a theological perspective. We're talking about people who are committed to truth, both capital T truth and lowercase t truth, eternal truth of Jesus and the good news, and the lowercase t truth of that which corresponds to reality. And when you are committed to the truth, it will divide, it will separate, it will cut you off from certain people. That's when they came to Jesus and they said, Jesus, your mother and brothers are looking for you. And what did Jesus say? He looked around and says, these are my mother and sister and brothers, whoever does the will of the Father. So what we're seeing is the true household of God emerging. That you thought it was your good friend, that you thought it was your family member, but it's actually those who are committed to truth and to doing the will of the Father. And it's painful.
It is. Yeah.
It's immensely painful to feel yourself cut off from people who you're related to by blood, or you have a deep, long relational history with, to find out you're divided by truth. So then what are your options? You can acquiesce and say the truth's not all that important. I'd rather preserve this relationship. I'm actually not mad at you if you do. I understand, because those ties are strong, but you've compromised truth in the process. You can browbeat them over the head with truth. God, the Ephesians says, speak the truth in love. Some of us love the speaking the truth part. Not so much the love part, but we want to beat them over the head with the truth to hope that they'll change. Probably won't work. Or you can speak the truth in love and say, though it brings me sorrow, though it makes me heavy-hearted, I'm not going to compromise on justice, on loving my neighbor, on a commitment to that which corresponds to reality, but I'll always leave the light on for you. My wife, I often work late, and she's so very good about literally leaving the light on in the living room for when I get home, so that she's not walking into a dark house. And leaving that light on is sort of a sign of welcome. It's a sign that no matter when you come home, you'll be welcome here. And so what does it look like for us to leave the relational light on for people who don't get it now, or who don't get it yet, but might one day be persuaded of the truth? And we have to live our lives in such a way that they might one day be persuaded, even as we say, I can't walk with you on this part of the journey.
That's really good. Well, Lord, do you have any more final questions for Mr.
I do just probably have one question, and I'm gonna kind of make it broad so I can get a lot out of you. For those of us who are wanting to continue the social justice, racial unity, not just in a church, but even in our communities, because I know personal people who put their bodies on the line, put their minds, put their families on the line. How can they be replenished? How can they not only just give of themselves, but an avenue where there is a place where they can make that a part of their building financially, where they're not being run out dry, but that they can funnel that energy, that passion, like you, where you're writing books and you're a part of an institution where you can actually see that translated into policies, a major change in the communities. How can you give advice to those who are wanting to do this as a career or as a professional, as to see it more instead of just, you know, a small group at church or at home, and we're just talking our heads off, but seeing real change?
I'll try to be real practical on this. Yeah, it is a marathon, not a sprint. And so how do we sort of pace ourselves? One very practical thing is, do you have a hobby? Like literally, do you have something that is not this work to do that you enjoy, that's a skill you can build? I don't have a hobby because I don't have that much patience. I did in the past year during the pandemic get into building Legos. And that was a good outlet. It was something I could do with my son, although I tried to get him his own stuff because I wanted to do it myself. But that's me. For the first time in my life, I started jogging regularly. I haven't kept it up. It got cold and then I didn't get started again, but that is what it is. And I'm very slow. But physical exercise is huge. Mental health therapy, talking to you Black folks, you know how we do. Get your church to pay for it if you can, or insurance. And there's online stuff. So I use betterhelp.com, but there's a variety of them. And it's great because you can easily switch therapists. They also do unlimited texting. You can do Zoom calls. I do the old-fashioned way as a geriatric millennial. I do phone calls, but it's very adaptable. I get strength from the journey from history. The phrase I've been using the past couple of days, if you want to pray for me, pray that I finish this dissertation soon. I have to defend by August, but I got to get a draft in the next 3 to 4 weeks. But as I'm studying this content, the phrase I've been using is that my heart hums in harmony with history. My heart hums in harmony with history. There's just something like, even when you're reading about the hard stuff, to know that this isn't the first time we've gone through it, and to know that we are not off base, because we face so much gaslighting, people telling us that what we've seen and what we experience and what we know is not really what we've seen or what we've experienced and what we know. Then you can look back in history and say, oh, you know what? Police brutality was a problem, been a problem. Because the Black Panthers, when they were formed, was called, the full name was Black Panther Party for Self-Defense against police brutality, right? Like that stuff's encouraging in a weird way, but it's also encouraging to see the resilience and the hope and the fortitude. We have this great cloud of witnesses that aren't just in the Bible, but throughout history, and we should learn about them. The group chat is therapy for me. So one of the things I think this pandemic has taught me even more clearly is that the church is more than just a place, it's a people. And I say that because your community that strengthens you may not be in your local congregation. I'm not diminishing the local church. It's important to be a part of a local body, but the people who get you and who understand this racial justice struggle, they may not be in your congregation. And so the challenge is to find out where they are and how to connect with them in meaningful ways.
They're right here.
Yeah, exactly. And that's okay. It's like, God's not going to be mad that you found other believers and they're in a different time zone or you're connecting through a screen. Like, that's okay. But to make sure that we're not limiting our conception of community so that we can seek and find the strength that we need to. So those are a few ways.
Well, Jemar, we know that time flies and we could probably listen to you for another 45 more minutes. But I know I want to respect your time, and I just want to say I appreciate you being here. We are rooting for you all the way over in Minnesota. We are praying for you. The next time I see you, it will be Dr. Tisby. So just keep it going. But we just want to just bless you and to thank you again for just even taking this time out. If there are any final thoughts you have about anything we've talked about, CRT, I don't know if you want to talk about that anymore, or anything that you want to talk about, just to leave us with one final thought, and then we'll let you go.
I'm gonna do shameless plugs because as Black folks, ain't nobody gonna do it for us. So if you haven't bought the book, get the book. I also want this to be done in a group study like y'all have done, but if there are other networks that you have, it lends itself. And then I'll give you another hint, practical hint. However long it takes you to get through the book, tack on 2 more weeks to strategize and come up with a plan for actually taking action. One of the things I've been saying is the gap between intention and action is a plan. The gap between intention and action is a plan. 10 cents every time you use that. Now, make a plan, right? And then, yes, we got video teaching series, we got study guide, we got ebook, audiobook, every format. Thank you, Lord me.
I have the audible books too.
See, okay.
Yeah, I got the Amazon Prime Video. I got the actual DVD.
Pre-order this
fan club
book.
Over here.
This bad boy is out June 1st. The Coming Race Wars, Bill Pinnell. It's available for pre-order wherever books are sold.
Can we give Carl Nelson probably, if he wanted to say a quick hello to you, Jemar?
I don't want to talk, Carl. No, I'm just messing with you.
Hey, well, thanks to the rest of the group for letting me come and be a guest tonight. And yeah, Jemar, thanks for giving time to us here in Minnesota tonight, as well as some of the other video projects that you have done and traveling here almost 2 years ago now. So I love to continue listening to what you're doing, your work, your writing. And by the way, congratulations on your post in Boston. So I'm really excited about that.
Thank you. It's great to see you. It's great to see you. The last word is this, y'all. This is the civil rights movement of our day. I'm not being facetious. I'm not being hyperbolic. I study race, religion, and social movements, specifically civil rights movement and Black Power movement. And I also have heard living testimony from people like Myrlie Evers, the widow of Medgar Evers, who in 2018, at the grand opening of the Civil Rights Museum in Mississippi, the only state-funded civil rights museum in the country, she said, it feels today like it did when her husband was killed. So it's not just Jemar saying this is the civil rights movement of our day. If that is the case, will you be the Christian moderate? Or will you be the extremist for love and the extremist for justice that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in his letter from a Birmingham jail? Go back and reread that tonight. Just a few pages. We need to be extremists for love. And we ain't gonna get another shot at this. Should the Lord tarry, they'll write history books about this period. What do you want your legacy to be? There's a lot of fear in us. What are they gonna say? What are they gonna do? What will be the consequence? What if I get it wrong? There's a lot of fear in us. Fear God, not man. Let that guide you. Read Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. Be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous. For I, the Lord, your God, am with you.
Amen.
Now's our time, y'all.
Jemar, you asked a question real quick. I'm going to introduce you to my older brother who is in Boston. You said you're looking for a place to live. He will hook you up. This is
nice.
Jemar's wife, Ivy.
That's what's up.
I'll say goodbye.
Appreciate y'all. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good night.
Blessings.
God bless you. All
Okay,
right,
that's a good
Sam.
night. Just to Mr. Tisby, not everyone else. If you guys are wanting to do like a wrap up or